habla sobre cómo realmente trabajar para Miyazaki.
For example, this clip from Hayao Miyazaki's The Wind Rises lasts 4 seconds, but it took 15 months to animate. And this is the face of one of the animators, maybe the
4 segundos y duró 15 meses.
It started working as an animator in 1963 with Toei Animation. Yeah, that Toei Animation. And in 1979, 13 years after starting his career in animation, he directed his first animated feature film, The Castle of Cagliostro. And while it was released to critical success and Hayao made consistent effort to continue directing, he didn't have another opportunity to direct an animated feature film until 1983, when Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind went into pre-production.
Ahora mismo hay una chica colombiana que está bien viral porque ella fingió que trabaja en Estudio Ghibli. Que yo no quiero meterme mucho en ese tema. La jeva fingió, se dio en cuenta que era falso. Pero yo quiero que veamos un poco, que eso me recordó a un documental que yo vi de YouTube. Bueno, documental, video ese, que habla sobre cómo realmente trabajar para Miyazaki. Ustedes saben que en Miyazaki, el creador principal de Estudio Ghibli, que el pana siempre, si esa industria de por sí es difícil, el pana siempre ha tenido la fama de ser súper perfeccionista. Y lo interesante es que quien cuenta esa historia es su hijo, que también está súper interesante, como es su hijo diciendo cómo es trabajar para él.
Exacto, antes de poner el video, a la gente que cree que, exacto, trabajar haciendo anime o lo que sea es un color de rosa. Claro que no. Primero esa gente, loco, trabajan en el estudio Ghibli a mano, o sea, que ellos no usan los dibujos, cada uno, o sea, frame por frame por frame por frame, para que darle esa calidad, porque la mayoría de lo que usan es vaina 3D ahora, que se lo llena, o sea, como que...
Digo, yo creo que en el anime todavía como que la mayoría...
No, bro, o sea, bro, o sea, digital, ¿cómo te digo? No es a mano una parte, pero el procesado es digital y como lo hacen, le llenan muchísima vaina con la computadora. O sea, que pues en el estudio Ghibli, no, loco. Por eso no sé, hay un video que siempre sale famoso en Twitter de ellos mismos, de que como el estudio Ghibli hace la comida y ellos friendo un huevo, de que cortando una vaina, que tú ves que eso se ve de que es súper smooth. Cuando tú un pedazo de carne friendo, como que tú crees que de verdad.
Loco, tú sabes lo que yo vi también, que me salió una vez, creo que en Instagram o algo. Que el pan, un ejemplo, Miyazaki, que es el director, él no manda, por ejemplo, con eso de la comida, él nada más pone platos que él sepa hacer. Si él no lo sabe hacer, él no pone ningún maldito plato.
Como que la receta.
No, porque él dice que él tiene que saber hacerlo, como para él
para que
saber
se vea,
dibujar los heavy, y que se vea apetitoso, vaya.
Ese es para un genio, pero por eso mismo lo que se ve que pira de como de perfeccionista.
No, pues, solamente con eso soy complicado.
Entonces, para los latinitos que sueñen con eso, que son muchos, que sepan cuál es la realidad, ¿verdad? De trabajar a ese nivel, con un pana como ese, en esa industria, que es bien competitiva y bien pesada, ¿verdad?
Claro.
Entonces, vamos a ver, loco.
Vamos al video.
Sometimes a small action can completely change the trajectory of a movie. Films are famously hard to create. It's easy to underestimate all the time, skill, and effort that goes into making one. And there are very few cases where this is more true than animation. For example, this clip from Hayao Miyazaki's The Wind Rises lasts 4 seconds, but it took 15 months to animate. And this is the face of one of the animators, maybe the
4 segundos y duró 15 meses.
Dale un chin para atrás, loco.
Y era pila de, mucha gente, eso, exacto, mira, moviéndose, tú tienes que hacer cada movimiento de esa gente ahí a mano.
Ahora iba a felicitar al pana que lo hizo.
And this is the face of one of the animators, maybe the sole person who just spent a year and a half working on a 4-second clip, being congratulated by Hayao Miyazaki on how it turned out. And while that was a bit of an outlier, it does set the tone for how difficult and time-consuming the animating process can be, which doesn't even account for one of the most demanding aspects of making animation: experience. So what happens when you put a director with no experience in charge of animating a feature-length film? This is a tale of conflict, childhood trauma, artistic integrity, and above all, the sometimes intense demands of making a piece of art. My name is Pei, and today we're talking about how one drawing completely changed the trajectory of an entire film. In doing research for another video I'm currently working on, I've been watching 10 Years with Hayao Miyazaki.
Entonces, alguna reacción del intro del video.
No, bro, yo sé, yo que viví por allá, por Asia, yo sé cómo trabajan los japoneses. Tienen una ética de trabajo, loco, súper explotadora. Sí. El overtime es casi obligatorio, loco. Tienes que lamberle el culo a los jefes. O sea, they boss you around.
Los coreanos también me la hacen como ese flow.
Pero los japoneses son, porque son top, porque ellos son los más eficientes también, ¿sabes? Entonces ellos, esa eficiencia la tienen que mantener como ese es su signature de que nosotros somos los más eficientes. Y eso se ve en cómo explotan a los trabajadores. Pero, sí.
Vas por entonces. ¿Algo más que agregar?
It's an outstanding 4-part documentary series that accounts for 10 years of Hayao Miyazaki's career with Studio Ghibli. And in watching this documentary, a surprising storyline emerged about Hayao Miyazaki and his son. And to properly understand that story, we should start first with the 2006 Ghibli film Tales from Earthsea. While it was released to commercial success, critics claimed it failed to live up to Studio Ghibli's standards. This was also salt in an already open wound. Hayao Miyazaki had fought hard to prevent Goro from being the director of the feature film. He felt he was inexperienced, hadn't developed the proper skills yet, and was unprepared for the job. Hayao had started working as an animator in 1963 with Toei Animation. Yeah, that Toei Animation. And in 1979, 13 years after starting his career in animation, he directed his first animated feature film, The Castle of Cagliostro. And while it was released to critical success and Hayao made consistent effort to continue directing, he didn't have another opportunity to direct an animated feature film until 1983, when Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind went into pre-production. And under that lens, it might make more sense why Hayao was so critical of his son being thrown into the deep end right away. Independent of whether or not he ended up being right or was justified, it strained their relationship intensely, and they didn't talk for a good period of time. Because of his aspirations and dedication to his work, Hayao Miyazaki was a self-proclaimed absent father. Goro's primary connection to his father was through his animated films. This was also paired with the unique difficulties that come with being the son of Hayao Miyazaki. Because the main way to connect to his father was through his animated films, Goro established a fascination with animation and a dream to eventually create his own animated films. So while Goro had a passion and interest in making animated films when he was younger, it never came to fruition. This was likely because of a multitude of reasons. Maybe because of the unresolved conflict between him and his father, or the overwhelming burden of expectation that comes with being Miyazaki's son and working in animation. So instead, he went to university for landscape architecture. And in 1998, he had an opportunity to work with Studio Ghibli in the creation of the Ghibli Museum outside of Tokyo. Toshio Suzuki, one of the co-founders of Studio Ghibli and the man largely responsible for Hayao Miyazaki's resurgence as an animated director, is a producer at Studio Ghibli. And when working on an animation adaptation of the book series Tales from Earthsea, Suzuki hired Goro, who was a huge fan of the book series, as a consultant for the project. Suzuki then saw potential in Goro. Pointing towards his creativity, he offered Goro the opportunity to direct the film. This was followed by that strong pushback we talked about earlier from Hayao Miyazaki. However, in many ways it felt like Suzuki was just giving the same faith to Goro that he'd once given his father. I would argue that Suzuki is in some ways equal parts responsible for the grand success of Studio Ghibli. If you look at a lot of world-class directors, you'll often find someone behind the scenes who's an incredibly stabilizing force. This documentary has taught me a lot of things, but the one that stands out the most is that Hayao Miyazaki, someone who I've put on a pedestal for a large portion of my life, is a human being with flaws. He has an incredible ability to see beauty in stories and the world around him, but then also struggles to practice that same expression in individual relationships.
Pero la animación está de pinga, yo tengo una vaina que fuck you leve. No, pero parece que el tipo jode mucho, porque que...
Pero tú viste que él quiso ser arquitecto, loco. Pero es que al final, loco, vamos a ver. Tu
pero
papá,
el papá le consigue un contrato para que hiciera, él no se puede quejar.
Sí, pero eso
claro, el papá lo puso a comer.
Claro,
él no todo
ahí.
es malo, exacto. El papá es un bacano. Lo que pasa es que quizá él no rindió. Tú sabes, eso pasa con los hijos, que
No
el papá quiere como que la expectativa tú no la llenas.
pero también ellos decían, loco,
That's
que
it.
el papá era un padre ausente, loco. O sea, tampoco como que era el mejor papá del mundo. Como que nunca estaba ahí.
Sí,
y la
pero
única forma de él como conectar con él era a través de la animación. Eso es un poco fucked up también.
Es una estrella, el pana, loco, una leyenda.
Está todo, por más leyenda que tú seas, loco, tú tienes tu responsabilidad contigo, creo yo.
Por
¿no?
ende,
Sí, claro.
tú tienes que
así.
estar ausente porque tú estás
No,
creando un
no,
imperio.
no te la compro.
Estás creando un imperio, manito.
No te la compro.
Ya tú sabes, loco, la verdad es que esa gente son raras, loco. Esa gente son raras.
Loco, ¿qué te digo? Yo sabiendo que, o sea, el calibre que tiene el papá en la industria, loco. No me va a decir tú que él no sabía que el papá lo iba a joder más que el diablo.
Exacto, él tiene esos zapatos.
Claro, él tenía que estar por lo menos consciente de que le iba a pasar algo parecido. Y nada, loco, qué mal. Yo, si me hubiera tocado algo parecido así, yo no me meto en ese bobo, porque realmente...
Sí, pero, coño, también como dices, tú estás empezando ya con la puerta abierta, que es una super mega empresa, la empresa de anime muy importante.
Yo quiero ser bombero. Yo no voy a ser animador.
Yo no voy a ser animador,
bombero, no hable de eso.
Policía.
El tipo ya era arquitecto, lo que debió seguir diseñando su edificio.
Claro, y vamos a hacer entonces los headquarters, ahora lo voy a hacer yo.
Y
le gustaba la animación. Bueno,
y más como tú dices, que si eres un padre ausente, tú estás loco. ¿Y para qué yo me voy a meter?
No ver la cara ese tío.
Detrás de nada, loco, ahí, loco, joderse cuando viene a veces pana lo que salió enemigo de su papá de ahí, loco.
Claro.
Peor todavía.
Dale ahí, a ver.
¿Cómo termina la trama?
Yet, despite Hayao Miyazaki's pushback, Toshio Suzuki and Goro did not falter. They decided to make the film anyways. But we know how that turned out. And a terrible bookend for the film's critical failure was when it was awarded both Worst Director and Worst Movie at the end of 2006 at the Bunshun Raspberry Awards. Despite the criticism, Goro decided not to let it be his first and last film, acknowledging the fact that if he accepted that now, he would be stuck forever as a failed animated director. Because today's video isn't actually about Tales from Earthsea. Instead, we're going to be focusing on Goro's sophomore film, From Up on Poppy Hill. Stern in his resolve, Goro continued to work in animation. And 5 years after his directorial debut, Goro Miyazaki was given another opportunity. Based off of a 1980s manga, the adaptation was written by Hayao Miyazaki and Keiko Niwa. This uncharacteristic collaboration between father and son seemed to be an olive branch in their relationship. However, Hayao Miyazaki is not a simple man. Unable to let go of his artistic integrity, Hayao Miyazaki is famously someone that is incredibly difficult to work with. His remarkably high expectations and acute attention to detail are matched with an often aggressive and curt form of communication. Miyazaki seemed incapable of holding his opinions to himself, to the point where even before the project started, Goro felt the need to hide his storyboards from his father. And despite the privacy, eventually Hayao Miyazaki saw some of the work, colored stills from the animators based off of Goro's storyboards. Hayao then insisted they be taken down, that these drawings were lifeless, and he was concerned about the quality of the entire film if those were drawn from Goro's storyboards. Something important to know is that directors for anime films have a lot of responsibilities, but one of the most important is storyboarding the entire project. These storyboards are referenced when doing all of the in-between animation. Suzuki, noticing the increased tension in the studio, decided to intervene. He reviewed Goro's storyboards personally to gauge the quality, which decidedly wasn't there, which led to a tough and blunt conversation between Suzuki and Goro. If revisions weren't made to increase the quality of the storyboards, the film wouldn't go into production and would not be made. This is where the crux of today's story comes in. That drawing. Goro found himself at a potential impasse, struggling to find creative momentum. Finding creative solutions in art can be incredibly challenging, but doing it under a time crunch is even more difficult. Suzuki had given Goro a limited amount of time to make his changes, and in the middle
Es complicado, loco, trabajar. Eso me acuerdo de la colombiana de nuevo, loco. Eso no es cualquiera, man, que trabaja con ese loco de ahí, con Miyazaki.
Sí, así hay muchos que ven, ay, mi sueño es ser un animador de anime y trabajar en el estudio Ghibli. Coge pela, ¿no?
Exacto. A ver, si no es que está mal. Si te gusta y de verdad tú crees que tú tienes talento, tú te fucking te matas.
Claro.
Está bien que tú lo hagas, pero tú sabes, no va a ser el mejor trabajo, vamos a decir, las mejores condiciones de trabajo. Tú vas a participar en los mejores proyectos artísticos del anime.
Ni tampoco el dinero está ahí, porque esa gente son
También,
overpay, esa gente no le pagan nada, loco. Eso se queda en el estudio con todos esos cuartos. Igual, esa gente casi siempre están en bancarrota, o sea, ellos
Sí.
ellos necesitan un super peliculón que vuelva, loco, a darle como nombre, para ellos seguir gastando y tirar 3 películas mierda. O sea, que no tienen
bueno,
nada más la ve,
aquí
sí,
ya
lo
no.
que así,
Sí, pero-
nada más la ve su mamá, son excelentes en calidad, lo que sea. Tienen una cada 5 años así, un
Pero
peliculón.
eso es
Y así, esa es la estrategia de ellos.
Pero no creo que Estudio Ghibli le pase eso. Pues
Bro,
ya el referente en la industria.
Búscalo, que
No,
no,
pero que
porque-
todo lo que ya han tirado han sido hits últimamente.
No,
O sea,
que
¿cuál fue la
también
última vez
ya
que
Estudio
se
Ghibli
circularon?
también está con Disney, loco.
Exacto.
Ya,
Digo, no sabía ese dato, pero...
Sí.
Pero eso es demasiado grande.
Yo creo que Disney lo
Pero
compró
en
una
general
vaina
en la
así.
industria, lo que tú dices, como que es un trabajo no muy cool, loco.
Sí, claro.
Trabajan horas, incansables, dibujando.
Loco, pero mira ese mismo pana, loco.
Sí.
Como es Goro. Loco, ese pana tiene que estar yendo todavía a sesiones
De terapia.
Loco, yo me imagino que cuando la crítica le dijo, no, esa película es un disparate. El papá le dijo, tú un mojón, tú viste.
Sí,
Maldita
yo te
mierda.
lo dije,
Cagón, ¿cuántas veces yo te lo dije?
Yo te dije que fuera bombero.
Ya, está cabrón.
A little of this, Goro's staff received a drawing from Hayo, and while at first it seems simple, there are small attentions to detail, a subtle exaggeration that properly expresses who our protagonist is. It's something that Hayao Miyazaki does better than maybe anyone I've ever seen. The drawing is a wide shot of Umi, the main character, walking across a bridge to class. Leaning forward, she walks with long strides, demonstrating her determination. Because what this drawing showed Goro was how you breathe life into a character, and it completely changed the trajectory of the movie. Suddenly, he found his inspiration. And everyone around Goro saw the change in the way that he approached storyboarding. There was a new life to the characters that was substantial. While I was fascinated by the story behind this movie, there was a huge question mark that I had to explore, a major determining factor in whether or not I was going to make this video.
O sea, ellos dicen como que el pana de repente empezó a dibujar bien o algo así.
No, que le dijeron, él hizo una escena y la tipa estaba caminando como con vida, dijeron eso es así, como que tiene que traerle...
No, lo que pasa fue que él había perdido la inspiración después del bobo.
Sí.
Entonces 5 años después le dieron la oportunidad
Ok.
de hacerlo, pero no se encontraba en las mejores condiciones mentales para poder hacerlo.
Sí. Pero ahora lo hizo heavy, ¿verdad? Como que logró
Ajá.
volver a...
Logró volver a darle
Y estaba
vida
bonito,
con ese personaje que él está creando ahí. Como que encontró la inspiración y volvió otra vez a darle...
Con la jeva de la película.
From Up on Poppy Hill. I felt like for this story to come full circle, I needed to find something substantial within the movie. So when I sat down to watch Goro's film, I found myself rooting for him. He was an extreme underdog who showcased an intense amount of perseverance. Ghibli films lined the top of my list of all-time personal favorite movies, because ultimately what determined whether or not I was going to make this video was the quality of From Up on Poppy Hill. And as you can see, I made the video.
El gran mérito de ese pana, lo que puede trabajar con su papá, ¿no? Porque ese viejo se ve que es más jodón que el diablo.
No, incluso lo dijeron ahí, que el tipo es realmente perfeccionista.
Sí, no, es que ese nivel es verdad. Tú a cierto punto se ve mucho ese tipo de personalidades, de gente muy controladora, muy profesionista, muy neurótico, ¿verdad?
Loco, yo te doy al pensar que parece que para tú triunfar en ese tipo de industria, más del entretenimiento y cosas, uno tiene que llegar a ser hasta cierto punto así de perfeccionista, no sé. Porque el pana,
No creo.
los números están ahí, loco, el pana...
Sí, yo creo que hay dos formas para tú triunfar a niveles altos. Un consejo para la gente, no sé quién soy yo para ese tipo de consejos, pero hay dos formas. Tú tienes que ser así o muy obsesionado con tu trabajo, o lo contrario, que como tú no darle mente y hacer la cosa, tú sabes, como hacer la cosa sobre la marcha mucho. Yo creo que esas son como las dos gente que triunfan. Everything in between, creo que no.
Que no da resultado.
No funciona tanto.
Sí, yo creo que puede ser así también.
Bueno,
Tira, y pegate 2, 3.
Sí, atreverse, es fresco. O está muy obsesionado y cree que... Pero es otro tema, vamos a seguir viendo la vaina.
Films delve into the fantastic, with monsters and magic, spirits that walk alongside humans. And within these fantastic stories, Hayao Miyazaki often finds ways to talk about both the beautiful and overwhelming hardship of being a human and the human experience. Because Miyazaki consistently does things that make us feel like what we're perceiving are actual people, human beings with their own experiences and emotions, not just characters in a movie, and you can see that in the way he makes his movies. He's a discovery writer that focuses a lot on how his characters would react to circumstance. He has in mind an overarching theme. I think this leads to an environment where characters are never shoehorned into circumstance or moments purely to serve the plot. Because in Hayao's films, the plot comes from the characters, not the vice versa. And I think that's a big part of what makes them so special. And when it comes to Goro Miyazaki's sophomore film From Up on Poppy Hill, there's an element of that. It is incredibly reminiscent of his father's work. you can see clear inspiration, let alone the fact that Hayao was involved in writing the screenplay for this movie. But From Up on Poppy Hill doesn't delve into a world of fantastic. It's an incredibly grounded story about high schoolers. The primary plot of the story follows a group of students as they fight to prevent an old building from being demolished on campus. There are multiple moments that capture the unique energy that comes with youth. For example, one scene where the student body is holding a debate and screaming at one another until the teacher that's supposed to be observing it starts heading over and they all suddenly organize themselves and start singing the school anthem. There's a personality and character to this film that really captured a very unique part of my experience as a kid, and I think a lot of other people's experiences. It's a beautiful story that follows a much more common arc, so to see that classical Ghibli style being utilized in a different way was actually a very fun experience for me. Because ultimately the thing I would point to that made me enjoy this movie the most is the subtlety. It's a compelling story that won't hit you over the head with any plot point. The characters are so charming, which was essential for this story to hit. Because ultimately, I think this movie is about navigating the unique landscape of being a young adult, holding responsibility, finding your voice, but continuing to learn. Because when I sat down to watch this film, I came into the watching experience obviously biased, hoping that it would be good. And what I found was better than I had hoped for. This movie was charming and subtle, a fascinating case of being both very reminiscent of Hayao Miyazaki's work while feeling distinctly different. Where Hayao's work often finds subtle truths to the human experience and the fantastic, this movie did the opposite, finding the fantastic and subtle human experience. It wasn't the best Ghibli film, but it was great, a triumph of perseverance. Because I think in the end, I find myself very proud of what Goro made, and I think Hayao expressed that same sentiment. Because while his drawing changed the trajectory of the film, it ended up distinctly feeling like Goro's.
Qué duro está, en verdad,
el estudio Ghibli, compadre. Ellos son duros.
Bueno, al final parece que le cayó la boca al papá.
¿Tú crees?
No creo, pero vamos a decir que sí.
Yo te dije.
Que hizo una buena película al final. Y
sí,
ya.
exacto.
Sí, muy buena esa película, yo la vi, pero no me acuerdo bien de qué. Pero sé que era muy buena. Como que
LOL.